All right, we are back for another part of Love in the Time of Cholera. We're right at the beginning of chapter 4. It is page 165. And this is going to be in 4 parts because this chapter is kind of long. So here we go. The day that Florentino Ariza saw Fermina Daza in the atrium of the cathedral in the 6th month of her pregnancy and in full command of her new condition as a woman of the world, he made a fierce decision to win fame and fortune in order to deserve her. He did not even stop to think about the obstacle of her being married, because at the same time he decided, as if it depended on himself alone, that Dr. Juvenal Urbino had to die. He did not know when or how, but he considered it an ineluctable event that he was resolved to wait for without impatience or violence, even till the end of time. He began at the beginning. He presented himself unannounced in the office of Uncle Leo XII, president of the board of directors and general manager of the River Company of the Caribbean, and expressed his willingness to yield to his plans. His uncle was angry with him because of the manner in which he had thrown away the good position of telegraph operator in Villa de Leyva, but he allowed himself to be swayed by his conviction that human beings are not born once and for all on the day their mothers give birth to them, but that life obliges them over and over again to give birth to themselves. Besides, his brother's widow had died the year before, still smarting from rancor, but without any heirs, and so he gave the job to his errant nephew. It was a decision typical of Don Leo XII Loaysa. Inside the shell of a soulless merchant was hidden a genial lunatic, and willing to bring forth a spring of lemonade in the Guajira desert, as to flood a solemn funeral with weeping at his heartbreaking rendition of In questa tomba oscura. His head was covered with curls, he had the lips of a faun, and all he needed was a lyre and a laurel wreath to be the image of the incendiary Nero of Christian mythology. When he was not occupied with the administration of his decrepit vessels, still afloat on the sheer distraction on the part of fate, or with the problems of river navigation, which grew more and more critical every day, he devoted his free time to the enrichment of his lyrical repertoire. He liked nothing better than to sing at funerals. He had the voice of a galley slave, untrained but capable of impressive registers. Someone had told him that Enrico Cazzuro could shatter a vase with the power of his voice, and he had spent years trying to imitate him, even with the window panes. His friends brought him the most delicate vases they had come across in their travels through the world, and they organized special parties that he might at last achieve the culmination of his dream. He never succeeded. Still, in the depth of his thundering, there was a glimmer of tenderness that broke the hearts of his listeners as if they were crystal vases of the great Caruso, and it was this that made him so revered at funerals, except at one, when he thought it a good idea to sing When I Wake Up in Glory, a beautiful and moving funeral song from Louisiana, and he was told to be quiet by the priest, who could not understand that Protestant intrusion in his church. And so, between operatic encores and Neapolitan serenades, his creative talent and his invincible entrepreneurial spirit made him the hero of river navigation during the time of its greatest splendor. He had come from nothing, like his dead brothers. All of them went as far as they wished, despite the stigma of being illegitimate children, and even worse, illegitimate children who had never been recognized. They were the cream of what in those days was called the shop-counter aristocracy, whose sanctuary was the commercial club. And yet, even when he had the resources to live like the Roman emperor he resembled, Uncle Leo XII lived in the old city because it was convenient to his business, in such an austere manner and in such a plain house that he could never shake off an unmerited reputation for miserliness. His only luxury was even simpler, a house by the sea, 2 leagues from his offices, furnished only with 6 handmade stools, a stand for earthenware jars, and a hammock on the terrace where he could lie down to think on Sundays. No one described him better than he did when someone accused him of being rich. "No, not rich," he said. "I'm a poor man with money," which is not the same thing. His strange nature, which someone once praised in a speech as lucid dementia, allowed him to see in an instant what no one else ever saw in Florentino Ariza. From the day he came to his office to ask for work, With his doleful appearance and his 26 useless years behind him, he had tested him with the severity of a barracks training that could have broken the hardest man, but he did not intimidate him. What Uncle Leo XII never suspected was that his nephew's courage did not come from the need to survive or from a brute indifference inherited from his father, but from a driving need for love, which no obstacle in this world or the next would ever break. The worst years were the early ones, when he was appointed clerk to the board of directors, which seemed a position made to order for him. Vittorio Thugut, Uncle Leo XII's old music teacher, was the one who advised him to give his nephew a writing job because he was a voracious, wholesale consumer of literature, although he preferred the worst to the best. Uncle Leo XII disregarded what he said concerning his nephew's bad taste in reading, for Vittorio Thugut would also say of him that he had been his worst voice student, and still he could make even tombstones cry. In any case, the German was correct in regard to what he had thought about least, which was that Florentino Ariza wrote everything with so much passion that even official documents seemed to be about love. His bills of lading were rhymed no matter how he tried to avoid it, and routine business letters had a lyrical spirit that diminished their authority. His uncle himself came to his office one day with a packet of correspondence that he had not dared to put his name to, and he gave him the last chance to save his soul. "If you cannot write a business letter, you will pick up the trash on the dock," he said. Florentino Ariza accepted the challenge. He made a supreme effort to learn the mundane simplicity of mercantile prose, imitating models from notarial files with the same diligence he had once used for popular poets. This was the period when he spent his free time in the arcade of the scribes, helping unlettered lovers to write their scented love notes in order to unburden his heart of all the words of love that he could not use in customs reports. But at the end of 6 months, no matter how hard he twisted, he could not wring the neck of his die-hard swan. So that when Uncle Leo XII reproached him a second time, he admitted defeat, but with a certain haughtiness. "Love is the only thing that interests me," he said. "The trouble," his uncle said to him, "is that without river navigation, there is no love." He kept his threat to have him pick up trash on the dock, but he gave him his word that he would promote him step by step up the ladder of faithful service until he found his place. And he did. No work could defeat him, no matter how hard or humiliating it was. No salary, no matter how miserable, could demoralize him. And he never lost his essential fearlessness when faced with the insolence of his superiors. But he was not an innocent either. Everyone who crossed his path suffered the consequences of the overwhelming determination, capable of anything, that lay behind his helpless appearance. Just as Uncle Leo XII had foreseen, and according to his desire that his nephew not be ignorant of any secret in the business, Florentino Ariza moved through every post during the 30 years of dedication and tenacity in the face of every trial. He fulfilled all his duties with admirable skill, studying every thread in that mysterious warp that had so much to do with the offices of poetry, but he never won the honor he most desired, which was to write just one acceptable business letter. Without intending to, without even knowing it, he demonstrated with his life that his father had been right when he repeated until his dying day that there was no one with more common sense, no stone-cutter more obstinate, no manager more lucid or dangerous than a poet. That, at least, is what he was told by Uncle Leo XII, who talked to him about his father during moments of sentimental leisure and created an image that resembled a dreamer more than it did a businessman. Bottom of 168. He told him that Pius V Lietza used the offices for matters more pleasant than work, and that he always arranged to leave the house on Sundays, with the excuse that he had to meet or dispatch a vote. What is more, he had an old boiler installed in the warehouse patio, with a steam whistle that someone would sound with navigation signals in the event his wife became suspicious. According to his calculations, Uncle Leo XII was certain that Florentino Ariza had been conceived on a desk in some unlocked office on a hot Sunday afternoon, while from her house his father's wife heard the farewells of a boat that never sailed. By the time she learned the truth, it was too late to accuse him of infamy, because her husband was already dead. She survived him by many years, destroyed by the bitterness of not having a child, and asking God in her prayers for the eternal damnation of his bastard son. The image of his father disturbed Florentino Ariza. His mother had spoken of him as a great man with no commercial vocation, who had at last gone into the river business because his older brother had been a very close collaborator of the German Commodore Johann B. Elbers, the father of river navigation. They were illegitimate sons of the same mother, a cook by trade, who had them by different men, and all bore their surname and the name of a pope chosen at random from the calendar of saints' days, except for Uncle Leo XII, named after the pope in office when he was born. The man called Florentino was their maternal grandfather, so that the name had come down to the son of Transito Ariza after skipping over an entire generation of pontiffs. Florentino always kept the notebook in which his father wrote love poems, some of them inspired by Transito Ariza, its pages decorated with drawings of broken hearts. Two things surprised him. One was the character of his father's handwriting, identical to his own, although he had chosen his because it was the one he liked best of the many he saw in a manual. The other was finding a sentence that he thought he had composed, but that his father had written in the notebook long before he was born. "The only regret I will have in dying is if it is not for love." He had also seen only two pictures of his father. He had also seen the only two pictures of his father. Oh, that is. One had been taken in Santa Fe when he was very young, the same age as Florentino Ariza when he saw the photograph for the first time, and in it he was wearing an overcoat that made him look as if he were stuffed inside a bear, and he was leaning against a pedestal that supported the decapitated gaiters of a statue. The little boy beside him was Uncle Leo XII, wearing a ship captain's hat. In the other photograph, his father was with a group of soldiers, in God knows which of so many wars, and he held the longest rifle, and his mustache had a gunpowder smell that wafted out of the picture. It was a liberal and a Mason. He was a liberal and a Mason, just like his brothers, and yet he wanted his son to go to the seminary. Florentino Ariza did not see the resemblance that people observed, but according to Uncle Leo XII, Pius V was also reprimanded for the lyricism of his documents. In any case, he did not resemble him in the pictures, or in his memories of him, or in the image transfigured by love that his mother painted, or in the one unpainted by his Uncle Leo XII with his cruel wit. Nevertheless, Florentino Ariza discovered the resemblance many years later, as he was combing his hair in front of the mirror, and only then did he understand that a man knows when he is growing old because he begins to look like his father. He had no memory of him on the street of windows. He thought he knew that at one time his father slept there, very early in his love affair with Transito Ariza, but that he did not visit her again after the birth of Florentino. For many years, the baptismal certificate was our only valid means of identification, and Florentino Ariza's recorded in the parish church of St. Tiburtius said only that he was the natural son of an unwed natural daughter called Transito Ariza. The name of his father did not appear on it, although Pius V took care of his son's needs in secret until the day he died. This social condition closed the doors of the seminary to Florentino Ariza, but he also escaped military service during the bloodiest period of our wars because he was the only son of an unmarried woman. Every Friday after school, he sat across from the offices of the River Company of the Caribbean, looking at pictures of animals in a book that was falling apart because he had looked at it so often. His father would walk into the building without looking at him, wearing the frock coats that Transito Ariza later had to alter for him, and with a face identical to that of St. John the Evangelist on the altars. When he came out many hours later, he would make certain that no one saw him, not even his coachman, and he would give him money for the week's expenses. They did not speak, not only because his father made no effort to, but because he was terrified of him. One day, after he waited much longer than usual, his father gave him the coins and said, "Take them and do not come back again." It was the last time he saw him, But in time, he was to learn that Uncle Leo XII, who was some 10 years younger, continued to bring money to Transita Ariza and was the one who took care of her after Pius V died of an untreated colic without leaving anything in writing and without the time to make any provisions for his only child, a child of the streets. Top of 171. The drama of Florentino Ariza, while he was a clerk for the River Company of the Caribbean, was that he could not avoid lyricism because he was always thinking about Fermina Daza, and he had never learned to write without thinking of her. Later, when he was moved to other posts, he had so much love left over inside that he did not know what to do with it, and he offered it to unlettered lovers free of charge, writing their love missives for them in the arcade of the scribes. That is where he went after work. He would take off his frock coat with his circumspect gestures and hang it over the back of the chair. He would put on the cuffs so he would not dirty his shirt sleeves. He would unbutton his vest so he could think better, and sometimes until very late at night he would encourage the hopeless with letters of mad adoration. From time to time he would be approached by a poor woman who had a problem with one of her children, a war veteran who persisted in demanding payment of his pension, someone who had been robbed and wanted to file a complaint with the government. But no matter how he tried, he could not satisfy them, because the only convincing document he could write was a love letter. He did not even ask his new clients any questions, because all he had to do was look at the whites of their eyes to know what their problem was, and he would write page after page of uncontrolled love, following the infallible formula of writing as he thought about Fermina Daza and nothing but Fermina Daza. After the first month, he had to establish a system of appointments made in advance so that he would not be swamped by yearning lovers. His most pleasant memory of that time was of a very timid young girl, almost a child, who trembled as she asked him to write an answer to an irresistible letter that she had just received, and that Florentino Ariza recognized as one he had written on the previous afternoon. He answered it in a different style, one that was in tune with the emotions and the age of the girl, and in a hand that almost seemed to be hers, for he knew how to create a handwriting for every occasion, according to the character of each person. He wrote imagining to himself what Fermina Daza would have said to him if she had loved him as much as that helpless child loved her suitor. 2 days later, of course, he had to write the boy's reply with the same hand, style, and kind of love that he had attributed to him in the first letter, and so it was that he became involved in a feverish correspondence with himself. Before a month had passed, each came to him separately to thank him for what he himself had proposed in the boy's letter, and accepted with devotion in the girl's response, that they were going to marry. Oh. Only when they had their first child did they realize, after a casual conversation, that their letters had been written by the same scribe, and for the first time they went together to the arcade to ask him to be the child's godfather. Florentino Ariza was so enraptured by the practical evidence of his dreams that he used time he did not have to write a lover's companion that was more poetic and extensive than the one sold in doorways for 20 centavos, and that half the city knew by heart. He categorized all the imaginable suitors in which he and Fermina Daza might find themselves, or situations in which he and Fermina Daza might find themselves, and for all of them he wrote as many models and alternatives as he could think of. When he finished, he had some 1,000 letters in 3 volumes, as complete as the Covarrubias dictionary, but no printer in the city would take the risk of publishing them, and they ended up in an attic along with papers from the past, for Transita Ariza flatly refused to dig out the earthenware jars and squander the savings of a lifetime on a mad publishing venture. Years later, when Florentino Ariza had the resources to publish the book himself, it was difficult for him to accept the reality that love letters had gone out of fashion. As he was starting out in the River Company of the Caribbean and writing letters free of charge in the Arcade of the Scribes, the friends of Florentino Ariza's youth were certain that they were slowly losing him beyond recall. And they were right. When he returned from his voyage along the river, he still saw some of them in the hopes of dimming the memory of Fermina Daza. He played billiards with them, he went to their dances, he allowed himself to be raffled off among the girls. He allowed himself to do everything he thought would help him to become a man he had once been. Later, when Uncle Leo XII took him on as an employee, he played dominoes with his office mates, in the commercial club, and they began to accept him as one of their own when he spoke to them of nothing but the navigation company, which he did not call by its complete name but by its initials, the RCC. He even changed the way he ate. As indifferent and irregular as he had been until then regarding food, that was how habitual and austere he became until the end of his days. A large cup of black coffee for breakfast, a slice of poached fish with white rice for lunch, a cup of café con leche, and a piece of cheese before going to bed. He drank black coffee at any hour, anywhere, under any circumstances, as many as 30 little cups a day, a brew like crude oil, which he preferred to prepare himself, and which he always kept near at hand in a thermos. He was another person, despite his firm decision and anguished efforts to continue to be the same man he had been before his mortal encounter with love. That is not a lot of food he's eating. The truth is that he was never the same again. Winning back Fermina Daza was the sole purpose of his life, and he was so certain of achieving it sooner or later that he convinced Transito Ariza to continue with the restoration of the house so that it would be ready to receive her whenever the miracle took place. In contrast to her reaction with the proposed publication of The Lover's Companion, Transito Ariza went much further. She bought the house at once and underwent a complete renovation. They made a reception room where the bedroom had been. On the upper floor, they built 2 spacious, bright bedrooms, one for the married couple and another for the children they were going to have. And in the space where the old tobacco factory had been, they put an extensive garden with all kinds of roses which Florentino Ariza himself tended during his free time at dawn. The only thing that they left intact as a kind of testimony of gratitude to the past was the notion shop. The back room where Florentino Ariza had slept, they left as it had always been, with the hammock hanging and the writing table covered with untidy piles of books, but he moved to the room planned as the conjugal bedroom on the upper floor. This was the largest and airiest in the house, and it had an interior terrace where it was pleasant to sit at night because of the sea breeze and the scent of the rose bushes, but it was also the room that best reflected Florentino Ariza's Trappist severity. The plain whitewashed walls were rough and unadorned, and the only furniture was a prison cot, a night table with a candle and a bowl, an old wardrobe, and a washstand with its basin and bowl. The work took almost 3 years, and it coincided with a brief civic revival owing to the boom in river navigation and trade, the same factors that had maintained the city's greatness during colonial times and for more than 2 centuries had made her the gateway to America. But that was also the period when Transito Ariza manifested the first symptoms of her incurable disease. Her regular clients were older, paler, and more faded each time they came to the notions shop, and she did not recognize them after dealing with them for half a lifetime, or she confused the affairs of one with those of another, which was a very grave matter in a business like hers, in which no papers were signed to protect her honor or theirs, and one's word of honor was given and accepted as sufficient guarantee. At first, it seemed she was growing deaf, but it soon became evident that her memory was trickling away, and so he liquidated her pawn business. The treasure in the jars paid for completing and furnishing the house, and still left over were many of the most valuable old jewels in the city, whose owners did not have funds to redeem them. During this period, Florentino Ariza had to attend to too many responsibilities at the same time, but his spirits never flagged as he sought to expand his work as a furtive hunter. After his erratic experience with the widow Nazareth, which opened the door to street love, he continued to hunt the abandoned little birds of the night for several years, still hoping to find a cure for the pain of Fermina Daza. But by then he could no longer tell if his habit of fornicating without hope was a mental necessity or a simple vice of the body. His visits to the transient hotel became less frequent, not only because his interest lay elsewhere, but because he did not like them to see him there under circumstances that were different from the chaste domesticity of the past. Nevertheless, in 3 emergency situations, he had recourse to the simple strategy of an era before his time. He disguised his friends, who were afraid of being recognized as men, and they walked into the hotel together as if they were 2 gentlemen out on the town. Yet on 2 of these occasions, someone realized that he and his presumptive male companion did not go to the bar but to a room, and the already tarnished reputation of Florentino Ariza received the coup de grace. At last he stopped going there, except for the very few times he did so not to catch up on what he had missed, but for just the opposite reason, to find a refuge where he could recuperate from his excess. Top of 175. And it was just as well. No sooner did he leave his office at 5 in the afternoon than he began to hunt like a chicken hawk. At first he was content with what the night provided. He picked up serving girls in the parks, black women in the market, sophisticated young ladies from the interior on the beaches, gringas on the boat from New Orleans. He took them to the jetties where half of the city also went after nightfall. He took them wherever he could, and sometimes even where he could not. And not infrequently he had to hurry into a dark entryway and do what he could, however he could do it, behind the gate. The lighthouse was always a blessed refuge in a storm, which he evoked with nostalgia in the dawn of his old age, when he had everything settled, because it was a good place to be happy, above all at night, and he thought that something of his loves from that time, flashed out to the sailors with every turn of the light, so that he continued to go there more than to any other spot, while his friend, the lighthouse keeper, was delighted to receive him with a simple-minded expression on his face that was the best guarantee of discretion for the frightened little birds. There was a house at the foot of the tower, close to the thunder of the waves breaking against the cliffs, where love was more intense because it seemed like a shipwreck. But Florentino Ariza preferred the light tower itself, late at night because one could see the entire city and the trail of lights on the fishing boats at sea, and even in the distant swamps. It was in those days that he devised his rather simplistic theories concerning the relationship between a woman's appearance and her aptitude for love. He distrusted the sensual type, the ones who looked as if they could eat an alligator raw and tended to be the most passive in bed. The type he preferred was just the opposite, those skinny little tadpoles that no one bothered to turn around and look at in the street, who seemed to disappear when they took off their clothes, who made you feel sorry for them when their bones cracked at the first impact, and yet who could leave the man who bragged the most about his virility ready for the trash can. He had made notes of these premature observations, intending to write a practical supplement to the lover's companion. But the project met the same fate as the previous one after Asentia Santander sent him tumbling with her old dog's wisdom, stood him on his head, tossed him up and threw him down, made him as good as new, shattered all his virtuous theories, and taught him the only thing he had to learn about love, that nobody teaches life anything. Asentia Santander had had a conventional marriage for 20 years, which left her with 3 children who had married and had children in turn, so that she boasted of being the grandmother with the best bed in the city. It was never clear if she had abandoned her husband, or if he had abandoned her, or if they had abandoned each other at the same time, but he went to live with his regular mistress, and then she felt free in the middle of the day, and at the front door to receive Rosendo de la Rosa, a riverboat captain, whom she had often received in the middle of the night at the back door. Without grieving the matter a second thought, he brought Florentino Ariza to meet her. He brought him for lunch. He also brought a demijohn of homemade aguardiente and ingredients of the highest quality for an epic sancocho, the kind that was possible only with chickens from the patio, meat from tender bones, rubbish heaped pork, and greens and vegetables from the towns along the river. Nevertheless, from the very first, Florentino Ariza was not as enthusiastic about the excellence about the cuisine or the exuberance of the lady of the house as he was about the beauty of the house itself. He liked her because of her house, bright and cool, with 4 large windows facing the sea, and beyond that a complete view of the old city. He liked the quantity and the splendor of the things that gave the living room a confused and at the same time rigorous appearance, with all kinds of handcrafted objects that Captain Rosendo de la Rosa brought back from each trip until there was no room left for another piece. On the sea terrace, sitting in his private ring, was a cockatoo from Malaya, with unbelievable white plumage and a pensive tranquility that gave one much to think about. It was the most beautiful animal that Florentino Ariza had ever seen. Captain Rosenda de la Rosa was enthusiastic about his guest's enthusiasm, and he told him in detail the history of each object. As he spoke, he sipped aguardiente without pause. He seemed to be made of reinforced concrete. He was enormous, with hair all over his body except on his head, a mustache like a house painter's brush, a voice like a capstan, which would have been his alone, and an exquisite courtesy. But not even his body could resist the way he drank. Before they sat down to the table, he had finished half of the demijohn, and he fell forward onto the tray of glasses and bottles with a slow sound of demolition. Asentia Santander had to ask Florentino Ariza to help her drag the inert body of the beached whale to bed and undress him as he slept. Then, in a flash of inspiration that they attributed to a conjunction of their stars, the two of them undressed in the next room without agreeing to, without even suggesting it or proposing it to each other, and for more than 7 years they continued undressing wherever they could while the captain was on a trip. There was no danger of his surprising them, because he had the good sailor's habit of advising the port of his arrival by sounding the ship's horn, even at dawn, first with 3 long howls for his wife and 9 children, and then with 2 short melancholy ones for his mistress. Asentia Santander was almost 50 years old and looked it, but she had such a personal instinct for love that no homegrown or scientific theories could interfere with it. Florentino Ariza knew from the ship's itineraries that he could visit her, and he always went unannounced whenever he wanted to, at any hour of the day or night, and never once was she not waiting for him. She would open the door as her mother had raised her until she was 7 years old, stark naked, with an organdy ribbon in her hair. She would not let him take another step until she had undressed him, because she thought it was bad luck to have a clothed man in the house. This was the cause of constant discord with Captain Rosenda de la Rosa, because he had the superstitious belief that smoking naked brought bad luck, and at times he preferred to put off love rather than put out his inevitable Cuban cigar. On the other hand, Florentino Ariza was very taken with the charms of nudity, and he removed his clothes with sure delight as soon as he closed the door, not even giving him time to greet her, or to take off his hat or his glasses, kissing him and letting him kiss her with sharp-toothed kisses, unfastening his clothes from bottom to top, first the bottoms of his fly, one by one, after each kiss, and then his belt buckle, and at last his vest and shirt, until he was like a live fish that had been split open from head to tail. Then she sat him in the living room and took off his boots, pulled on his trouser cuffs so that he could take off his pants, while she removed his long underwear, and at last she undid the garters around his calves and took off his socks. Then Florentino Ariza stopped kissing her and letting her kiss him, so that he could do the only thing he was responsible for in that precise ceremony. He took his watch and chain out of the buttonhole in his vest, and took off his glasses and put them in his boots, so he would be sure not to forget them. He always took that precaution, always without fail, whenever he undressed in someone else's house. As soon as he had done that, she attacked him without giving him time for anything else, there on the same sofa where she had just undressed him, and only on rare occasions in the bed. She mounted him and took control of all of him, for all of her, absorbed in herself, her eyes closed, gauging the situation in her absolute inner darkness, advancing here, retreating there, correcting her invisible route, trying another, more intense path, another means of proceeding without drowning in the slimy marsh that flowed from her womb, droning like a horsefly as she asked herself questions and answered in her native jargon. Where was that something in the shadows that only she knew about, and that she longed for just for herself, until she succumbed without waiting for anybody? She fell alone into her abyss with a jubilant explosion of total victory that made the world tremble. Florentino Ariza was left exhausted, incomplete, floating in a puddle of their perspiration, but with the impression of being no more than an instrument of pleasure. He would say, "You treat me as if I were just anybody." She would roar with the laughter of a free female and say, "Not at all, as if you were nobody." He was left with the impression that she took away everything with mean-spirited greed, and his pride would rebel, and he would leave the house determined never to return. But then he would wake for no reason in the middle of the night, and the memory of the self-absorbed love of Asentia Santander was revealed to him for what it was, a pitfall of happiness that he despised and desired at the same time, but from which it was impossible to escape. One Sunday, 2 years after they met, the first thing she did when he arrived was to take off his glasses instead of undressing him, so that she could kiss him with greater ease. And this was how Florentino Ariza learned that she had begun to love him. Despite the fact that from the first day he had felt very comfortable in the house that he now loved as if it were his own, he had never stayed longer than 2 hours, and he had never slept there, and he had eaten there only once because she had given him a formal invitation. He went there, in fact, only for what he had come for, always bringing his only gift, a single rose, and then he would disappear until the next unforeseeable time. But on the Sunday when she took off his glasses to kiss him, in part because of that, and in part because they fell asleep after gentle love-making, they spent the afternoon naked in the captain's enormous bed. When he awoke from his nap, Florentino Ariza still remembered the shrieking of the cockatoo, whose strident calls belied his beauty. But the silence was diaphanous in the 4 o'clock heat, and through the bedroom window one could see the outline of the old city with the afternoon sun on its back, its golden domes, its sea in flames all the way to Jamaica. Asentia Santander stretched out an adventurous hand seeking the sleeping beast, but Florentino Ariza moved it away. He said, "Not now. I feel something strange, as if someone were watching us." She aroused the cockatoo again with her joyous laughter. She said, "Not even Jonah's wife would swallow that story." Neither did she, of course, but she admitted it was a good one, and the two of them loved each other for a long time in silence, without making love again. At 5 o'clock, with the sun still high, she jumped out of bed, naked as always, and with the organdy ribbon in her hair, and went to find something to drink in the kitchen. But she had not taken a single step out of the bedroom when she screamed in horror. She could not believe it. The only objects left in the house were the lamps attached to the walls. All the rest, the signed furniture, the Indian rugs, the statues, and the hand-woven tapestries, the countless trinkets made of precious stones and metals, everything that had made hers one of the most pleasant and best decorated houses in the city, everything, even the sacred cockatoo, everything had vanished. It had been carried out through the sea terrace without disturbing their love. All that was left were empty rooms, with the 4 open windows and a message painted on the rear wall: "This is what you get for fucking around." Captain Rosendo de la Rosa could never understand why Asentia Santander did not report the robbery or try to get in touch with the dealers in stolen goods or permit her misfortune to be mentioned again. And that is where we're going to stop.